So good morning, I am John Paul Arbuis and I will be your lecturer today for the third lecture series for the environmental science course, which is about environmental pollution. So the outline of the discussion is by discussing the basic concept of pollution, the atmospheric pollution, discussing the land pollution or solid waste management, and the water pollution. Now, pollution is defined. It is the introduction of harmful substance in the system. This is basically found everywhere, maybe from work, home, friends, or even in your classrooms. But in environment, environmental pollution is a contamination of air, water, or food in such a manner as to cause real or potential harm in nature without justification. In order to fully understand the concept of pollution, we should first define contaminants and pollutants, wherein contaminants are defined as inputs of alien and potentially toxic substance into the environment, such as waste materials produced by the living organisms and by natural environment. But waste produced by living organisms are not limited to their metabolic waste. You may also include waste coming from their activity, such as industrial waste. More on that later. So, pollutants are also defined as anthropogenically introduced substances that have harmful effects on the environment. But sometimes distinction between contaminants and pollutants is not simple, since concentration at which contaminants become pollutants cannot always be defined. Also, long-term damage to organisms or systems may occur that is not evident initially. In this slide, we show the different types of pollution. So there are types like air pollution, land pollution, noise pollution, water, and light pollution. So since we discussed about the basics of pollution, let's begin by discussing about one of those pollution, that is the atmospheric pollution. Now, pollution in the atmosphere is the most observable as it is more accessible than other types of pollution next to water pollution. Although the atmosphere has 5 layers, only 2 of those layers are in quality of concern. Those 2 are the stratosphere and the troposphere. Because most presentation is mostly driven by fear and visual observations, such as smoke blowing from factories, smog in skylines, as of the picture on the left, and smoke coming from old cars. Now, between stratosphere and troposphere, there is a layer called the stratospheric ozone layer. Now, this layer is photochemically formed organic oxidants. Classified ozone is a layer that filters out substantial amount of radiation from the sun. This UV radiation can cause damage and lead to certain forms of cancer, including the most fatal form, a melanoma. Ozone is a molecule composed of 3 oxygen atoms, photochemically formed, and an organic oxidant. Now, ozone may be either hazardous or beneficial depending largely on where it is. For example, hazardous as an oxidant in smog or smog ozone is an ozone that is typically found with the smog on the troposphere. Smog ozone reduces normal functioning of lungs because it inflames the cells that line the respiratory tract. Beneficial if it's in the ozone layer because it usually absorbs the UV radiation. Now, in 1970, scientists from the British Antarctic Service first noticed the apparent decline in the amount of ozone in the stratosphere above the Antarctic winter. They confirmed their findings with careful and annual measurements from 1980s to the present. The cause of the ozone loss was found to be caused by reaction with chlorine in the upper atmosphere, and the chlorine was found to have originated from human release of chlorofluorocarbons. Now, CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, along with other chlorine and bromine containing compounds, can accelerate the depletion of stratospheric layer, as seen from the list of reaction in the slide. Now, CFCs are generally comprehensible, non-flammable, and non-reactive, which led to many CFC uses, including as coolants for commercial and home refrigeration units and aerosol propellant. Now, in 1973, chlorine was found to catalyze ozone destruction. The catalytic destruction of ozone removes the odd-numbered oxygen species, the O3, but leaves the chlorine unaffected. This figure has shown the possible reaction right there. So next, that in 1990, Clean Air Act's amendments required to phase out of the production and use of ozone-destroying chemicals. By 1996, the United States no longer produced many propellants and other chemicals that destroy the ozone layer. For example, the chlorofluorocarbons, some halogens, and methyl chloroforms. The Clean Air Act also follows in the Philippines in the year 1999. Now, another part for the atmospheric pollution is the smog. Now, the term smog was coined to describe the adverse combination of smoke and fog in London during 1 week of December 1952, where a stagnant air and coal burning caused severe smog condition in London that ultimately took the lives of 12,000 people over a 3-month period. Now, let's define smog in more details now. Pointed fact that to make smog, it should at least have 3 ingredients, which is light hydrocarbons, radical sources such as oxides of nitrogen. Most air we breathe is elemental oxygen and nitrogen, and about 1% is composed of naturally occurring trace constituents such as carbon dioxide and water vapor. And in that 1%, a small part of that may be air pollutants, including gases and other particulate matter that is suspended into the air. Now, take note of this, that the pollutants, or the small parts of that 1%, is the pollutants that have a large effect in harming the organism or causing large-scale pollution. So think about that, So next is an example of a smog. So Aurora Borealis, also known as Northern Lights, is an example of smog. In this phenomenon is a result of oxygen and nitrogen in atmosphere losing its electron to become charged, and also an example of a photochemical reaction. Now, take note that Aurora Borealis only occurs in the polar regions of the Earth. Now, think if the Aurora Borealis is able to reach towards the equator, there would be a large amount of radiation that is passing through the atmosphere. So, seeing that in the equator would be a really terrible experience. So let's dig deeper, as a stratospheric ozone may cause smog to a much detailed air pollutants. Now, there are many types of air pollutants. Some gases, such as carbon dioxide, although produced by burning fossil fuels, are generally not considered pollutants because they are also essential to a plant life. But still, a large amount of those pollutants can cause a harm to vegetations, animals, or any kinds of organism as shown in the table of gaseous air pollutants. In accordance that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, classifies air pollutants according to two broad categories, mainly primary and secondary air pollutants. Now, primary pollutants enter the atmosphere directly from various sources. Example of those are carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and lead that we will discuss further to the next slide. So we start off at the carbon monoxide. Now, carbon monoxide or carbon monoxide, which is the major pollutant in urban air, is a product of incomplete combustion of fossil fuels or carbon-containing compounds. Now, carbon monoxide has relatively few natural sources, one of which is a cigarette smoke, and the other is internal combustion engine. Now, cause exhausting a large amount of carbon monoxide is due to a failed or broken catalytic converter. So there are times that when buying a second-hand car, the longer the mileage, you can notice that if the mileage is extremely long, the prices of that second-hand car will eventually go down as the mileage increases. That is because the catalytic converter is needed to be replaced, and that would cost you a lot of money. So carbon monoxide is fortunately the carbon monoxide concentrations are decreasing in United States because newer cars have higher fuel efficiencies, or basically have new cars. So next. So carbon monoxide, stationary combustion source produces carbon monoxide, which is oxidized to carbon dioxide while dispersing into the air from stationary source. Stationary source of carbon monoxide are significantly only quite near the source. So you can observe that by seeing a large amount of smog in urban areas, but you have less and less visible smog when you're going away from urban cities. So take it like if you go up north to, or have a place where no car was around. So it's basically just carbon monoxide is only near to its source. So most carbon monoxide in ambient air comes from the vehicle exhaust, as defined in the first bullet. Internal combustion engines do not burn fuel completely to carbon dioxide and water, and some unburned fuel will always be exhausted with carbon monoxide as a component. Now, the dangerous part in carbon monoxide is that it combines with hemoglobin to produce carboxyhemoglobin, which blocks the transport of oxygen. Like that. Now, next of the primary pollutant is the hydrocarbons. Now, hydrocarbons, or volatile organic carbons, are compounds composed of hydrogen and carbon. Methane, as the most abundant hydrocarbon in the atmosphere, is an active greenhouse gas. Now, volatile organics include non-methane hydrocarbons, such as benzene and their derivatives, such as formaldehyde. Some of these compounds are carcinogenic, and relatively reactive hydrocarbons contribute to ozone production in photochemical smoke. Hydrocarbons are produced naturally from decomposing organic matter and by certain types of plants such as pine trees and creosote bushes. Another primary pollutant is a particulate matter. Now, Particulate matter is a collective term for solid particles of liquid droplets that is small enough to be suspended by air. But these particles have no general chemical composition, unlike those with carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and other types of chemical composition. Now, we can characterize particulate matter by size. Particles whose diameter is greater than 10 micrometers or micrometers takes the vessel in less than a day, while those particulate matter with less than micrometer in diameter can take weeks or even months to settle. Such example of these are dust, fumes, mist, and smoke, or the incomplete combustion of cars. Now, next primary pollutant is the sulfur dioxide. Now, sulfur dioxide emissions come from sulfur containing fossil fuels that such as coal that contains up to 6% sulfur. Ore smelters and refineries also emit significant amount of SO2, and relative high amount of sulfur dioxide can cause respiratory problems. Sulfur dioxide is also a source of acid rain, as when sulfur combines with water droplets, it forms sulfuric acid. Now, sulfur dioxide and other tropospheric aerosols cause radiation balance in the atmosphere, which cause cooling in certain regions. So, aside from causing an acid rain, it also can cause a temperature imbalance in certain regions, such as there might be a major rain in less raining regions, or even a real hot climate in tropical regions. Now, next primary pollutants is a nitrogen oxide. Now, nitrogen oxide, or known as NOx, stands for an indeterminate mixture of nitrogen oxide or nitrogen dioxide. Now, nitrogen oxide form mainly in N2 and O2 during high temperature combustion of fuels in cars. Catalytic converters are used to reduce those emissions. Nevertheless, nitrogen oxide causes reddish-brown haze in city air that contributes to heart and lung problems, and as it worsens, may be carcinogenic. Nitrogen oxides also contribute in acid rains because they combine with water to produce nitric acid and other kinds of acid. Natural sources of nitrogen oxide include those produced during the metabolism of certain soil bacteria, or detritus species to be exact. Now, nitrogen dioxide is a pulmonary irritant. So, although little known of the specific toxic mechanism, high concentration of nitrogen dioxide can produce pulmonary edema and an abnormally high accumulation of fluid in the lung tissue. Nitrogen dioxide has never been found in such high concentration in ambient air as an air pollutant. It contributes synergistically to the effect of other pollutants. NO, the atmospheric precursor of nitrogen dioxide, is not an irritant gas. In fact, it is often used as an anesthetic, commonly known as a laughing gas. Another primary pollutant is lead. Now, lead is highly toxic, and its effects on humans have been recognized since the Roman Empire era. Now, lead can produce chronic impairments of the formation of blood, and its affects infant neurological development. Concentrations of lead in the environment in the United States are no longer high as they were prior to introduction to non-leaded gasoline in the 1970s, but is still a concern in many localities. So, lead-based paints continue to be a source of concern in this situation where children are exposed to paints that have been peeled off from building surfaces. Now, in Philippines, it's also a major concern, such as many toys or items that is for infants or toddlers that is purposely painted with lead to attract or to make the toy a little bit shiny. So, like, that's why at some news you can hear the some 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 government raids pertaining these kind of toys because lead can affect infants' neurological development. Now this time, we're gonna talk about the secondary pollutants. Now, secondary pollutants are formed during chemical reactions between primary air pollutants and other atmospheric constituents, such as water vapor. Generally, these reactions must occur in sunlight, thus they ultimately produce a photochemical smog. Secondary pollutants' favorable conditions are air temperatures exceeding 32 degrees Celsius, a low winds, an intense radiation, and low precipitation. In this table, here are some of the simplified set of reaction in a photochemical smog. As indicated, photochemical smog is mainly composed of an O3, a peroxyacetyl nitrate or PAN, and other oxidants. Ozone formation is closely tied to weather conditions, such as if there are low ozone, there would be a real hot climate due to a lot of UV radiation that is not bounced off and stuff like that. Now, that's the only secondary pollutants that is shown. Now, we're gonna talk about the acid rain. Now, acid rain is any rain with a pH level below 5.0. Now, pH level of a distilled water is 5.6 in equilibrium with the atmospheric CO2 constituents, but other constituent increases the acidity of rainfall even with places without air pollution such as sulfur. Now, as you can see that in the sample is a factory emitting smoke and a corroding steam on a bridge caused by the acid rain. We're gonna talk about coal. Now, in addition to sulfur, combustion of coal also emits toxic elements includes arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, and selenium. Now, cadmium and selenium are concentrated in coal which may be leached into surface water and may accumulate to toxic level and cause potential harm to aquatic organism. Now, mercury and selenium and other elements released into the atmosphere in stack emissions can move along distances, and mercury and selenium readily bioaccumulates on bird, mammal, and predatory fish. Mercury is generally released from point source, for example, a caustic soda, while sodium hydroxide plants and paper mills. Now, we're going to talk about the global climate change. Now, climate change has been known for some time that very large emissions of particulates into the atmosphere may be enough to induce a climate change. Example of that is the emission of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide by the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1990. Now, two aspects of global atmospheric change are generally considered to be together with air pollution and global climate change and destruction of the stratospheric ozone layer. Carbon dioxide has no other apparent adverse effects at low or moderate concentrations, but absorb energy at wavelengths of 1.5 heat energy and may contribute to global temperature change. Now, one of the arguments for taking action to address climate change is that climate change could be irreversible and that under many predicted scenarios such as change likely would lead to widespread and severe damage to public health and ecosystem. The ecological effects include loss of diversity and productivity. Some habitats are particularly vulnerable and irreversibility. Now, recognizing the problem of global climate change, the World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environment Program established a Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, in 1988. It collects most recent scientific evidence on all aspects of climate change, including output from AOGCMs, and predicts the potential impacts and options relevant to the risk of human-induced climate change. Now we're going to talk about the land pollution. Now, land pollution is connected to the atmospheric pollution by atmospheric fallout and precipitation. Though solid waste are most focused on pollutant in land, such as solid waste are often called municipal solid waste and consist of all the solid and semi-solid materials discarded by a community. Now, fraction of the municipal solid waste produced in domestic household are called refuse. Now, refuse is collected by certain types. So, commonly, solid waste is collected by trucks. These may be open bed trucks that carry trash and bagged refuse, but they are usually trucks that carry hydraulic rams to compact the fuse to reduce its volume so trucks can carry larger loads. Commercial and industrial collections are facilitated by the use of containers, which are either emptied into trucks with a hydraulic mechanism or carried by truck to the disposal site. Collection is the expensive part of waste management, and many new devices and methods have been proposed in order to cut costs. These are the garbage grinders, pneumatic pipes, kitchen garbage compactors, and transfer station. Now, we're going to talk about first the garbage grinders. Now, garbage grinders do put the extra load on the wastewater treatment plant, but sewage is relatively dilute and ground garbage can be accommodated in both sewers and treatment plants. The increased burden may be problematic in water-short communities, but it's rather effective when trying to put the refuse directly to the treatment plants. Now, another example of that is a pneumatic pipe. Now, this has been installed in some small communities, mostly in Sweden and Japan. Using pneumatic pipes, the refuse is ground at the residence and sucked through underground lines directly through the disposal sites. Now, another example is a kitchen garbage compactors. Now, a compactor costs about as much as other large kitchen appliances, but uses special high-strength bags so that operating cost is also a consideration. Last type of collection is a transfer station. Now, a typical system includes several stations located at various points in the city to which collection trucks bring the refuse. Now, transfer station needs the drive to each transfer station is relatively short, so workers spends more time collecting and less time traveling. At the transfer station, bulldozers pack the refuse into large containers that are trucked to the landfill or to any disposal sites. Now, in some countries have sewage treatment plants. This will give them the ability to further reduce the water pollution significantly low impact to the community, but in doing that, the facility produces a solid waste called biosolids. Now, biosolids are a byproduct of a physical or a biological and physico-chemical precipitation of suspended soils using chemical treatment processes. Now, on volume basis, concentration of pathogens in biosolids can be fairly high because of settling of large organisms and adsorption of viruses. Now, secondary biosolids are solids comes with the following biological treatment of water. Microbial populations in sludge following these treatments depends on the initial concentration in the wastewater, die-off or growth during treatments, and the association of this organism with sludge. Some treatment processes, such as activated sludge processes, may limit or destroy certain enteric microbial species. Viral and bacterial pathogens, for example, are reduced in concentration by activated sludge treatment. Now, another type of solid waste is nuclear waste. In nuclear power plants, they use radioactive materials to produce energy. In turn, they produce radioactive waste. However, radioactive materials can also originate from natural resources. The United States divides its radioactive waste into the following categories, which are high-level waste, transuranic waste, and low-level waste. So we're gonna discuss it later. Now, high-level waste consists of spent irradiated nuclear fuel from commercial reactors and liquid waste from solvent extraction cycles with solids that liquid waste have been converted into reprocessing. Transuranic wastes are alpha-emitting residues that contain the element with atomic number greater than 92, which atomic number of uranium. Now, low-level waste encompasses the radioactive waste that is not classified under the above categories. Low-level wastes are separated into subcategories from Class A, B, C, and greater than Class C or GTCC, with Class A being the least hazardous and GTCC being the most hazardous. Now, commercial low-level waste is generated by industry, medical facilities, research institutions, and universities, and a few government facilities. Now, besides from the other solid waste, there are other wastes such as dead animals which produce methane and attract harmful pathogens. There are ashes, or other particulate matters, and industrial waste. More on that later. Now, in land pollution, we tend to create a mitigation practices such as the reduce, reuse, and recycle. Now, reduce, reuse, recycle is one of the ideal move in lessening the amount of unnecessary pollutants such as plastic. There you go. Now, we're gonna tackle the last discussion. It would be the water pollution. Although the most observable type pollution is found in the atmosphere, the most relatable pollutant to humans is one that contaminates water. Now, in this figure shows the source pollutants and its modes of releases pollutants into the environment. Using this, we can conclude that the atmosphere is the most observable because the pollutants are floating in air, which we breathe. We can also conclude that water is the most affected in any type of pollution, as water is found nearly every edge of the earth, from small ponds to giant oceans. Even though water is essential to all life on earth, it has its own danger to compare to, such as what it contains and how many it contains. Now, there are types of pollutants in water, such as sludges and microbes. Now, sludge is suspended solids that enter the treatment plant and are partially removed in the primary settling of tank or clarifier. Now, ordinarily, 60% of these suspended solids becomes raw primary sludge, which is highly putrescent and contain pathogenic organism and is very wet. Now, water pollution in Philippines. Philippine government has committed series of action across the nation in expense of mitigation of excess pollution and preservation of natural forests, and acted to pollutions and some illegal industries that produce large amount of pollution, like foreign mining companies. Example of this is that of water pollution is that DNR announced that May Kawayan River is now a dead water system, that the river is unable to provide sustenance for humans and animals alike. But that does not mean that some organisms do not live on it. And that's all for the lecture number 3.